Yes, I've chosen to go first, Chris, so that I can have the easiest question to answer, which is the one on human rights impact assessments. Where are they going over the next 5 years? I mean, the problem is a very simple one, and John Ruggie referred to it in one of his papers 2 or 3 years ago. As a whole, companies don't conduct human rights impact assessments, and they're the most significant step that a company can take to improve its conduct. So we very much hope that human rights impact assessments will be a key guiding principle of Ruggie's, and that they'll be embedded into all kinds of mechanisms, whether it's the IFC's performance standards, so that companies are actually required to conduct these impact assessments. But the most important benefit for these impact assessments is for the communities affected. Because if an impact assessment isn't conducted at the feasibility stage of the project, it's very difficult for affected communities to have the baseline information on which it's possible to determine whether a company's interventions have had an adverse impact on them or not. Time and time again, when communities complain, whether it's to the World Bank's Compliance and Ombudsman's Office, the problem is to determine whether the harm done was caused by the company or whether it was caused by some other factors. Companies will always claim, even in the most, you'd think, clear-cut cases, that it wasn't their intervention, it was other factors. And human rights impact assessments, looking at impacts across the full spectrum of human rights, involving consultation with communities, put in the public domain, will make a huge difference. One of the obstacles, there are a couple of obstacles to these human rights impact assessments becoming undertaken routinely. One of them is that they actually take a lot of time, and for extractive companies, every day of lost revenue, because a human rights impact assessment needs to be taken, because there has to be an implementation and action plan for the recommendations of the impact assessments. That's actually a major chunk of time and can significantly affect the profitability of a company's operations. So I think it's absolutely essential that these happen, and I hope that Ruggie's principles will pave the way for these to happen, but I think we have a very long way to go before companies do them, in particular at the feasibility stage of a project, before the decision has been taken to go ahead with the project, and that the recommendations of the impact assessment should be the basis of a decision on whether the project should go ahead or not.
Thank you, Peter. Charmaine?
The voluntary sector obviously volunteering first here. I'd like to answer the point from, or the question from, I think his name was Carlos from Oxford University. He's sat back down, hello. Right, you were talking with regard to Iran and bank accounts. I'd like to broaden that out, because I think that this is as much about human rights as the discussion that we've all been having here tonight. Global Witness last year, in fact, launched a campaign looking at the way in which state looting is being entirely facilitated by respectable banking sector around the world. There is a real challenge about corruption. Everybody thinks it's very convenient to say, well, corruption is what happens over there. It's these corrupt African dictators, these corrupt government officials. But the really big question, the absolute major question, is where is all that money going? And it's going into bank accounts in Britain, in America, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Dubai, in Germany, all over the world. And if we are, as a group of people, if we are serious about the Millennium Development Goals, and we're serious about making poverty history, and we're really serious about respect for human rights, and the role that resources can play in developing those and building those human rights and development, then we have to tackle this issue of state looting. It's an enormous problem. Some figures from the OECD and others for 2009 these are approximate figures. So agricultural revenue, this is just Africa alone, agricultural revenue about 35 billion, aid into Africa about 44 billion, and the value of natural resources, including oil and gas, 394 billion. So I think those figures alone tell you where if you want to tackle civil society development, if you want to tackle poverty, if you want to build accountability and transparency, you have to tackle the revenue flows. And there is work around the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and now there's Finance Reform Act in the US that also calls for a requirement for companies to declare their payments that they make overseas if they're listed on the American stock exchanges. That's a major game changer. Most of the companies aren't very happy about it, but it is a major game changer. And I think that your question is a really good one, because at the end of the day, state looting is facilitating and funding a lot of human rights abuses. And if we don't tackle that, and if governments won't take responsibility, you know, we've been talking about governments taking responsibility for the actions of their companies overseas. They have to start taking responsibility for the actions of their companies, their banking sector, their financial sector in their own countries.
Thank you. So Mark, would you like to go next?
The first question on corporations is demos. I fully agree. Unless you have an internal culture, you'll never fix the external. An internal culture of respect, you'll never fix the external one. The comment on traditional structures, I think I would fully support it, but be cautious, because one of the problems that companies have had is going into countries looking at the visible traditional structures and assuming that it was functioning and operating through that. And my advice to any company would be get some solid work done on whether that structure actually reflects reality. Certainly in Nigeria, much of what we did not reflect the actual power structures in communities. I could talk for a long time on China and Pacific Rim. I think there is considerable progress. I'm actually reasonably optimistic, but China is not, contrary to many people's views, it's not a complete command and control country, and what is desired at the top does not always happen when they've let the market genie out of the bottle. On Arabian Gulf and migration, I was there recently at one of the UN Global Compact's local meetings, and that is an issue which I think something like a global compact network, bringing together businesses, civil society, and looking at labor conditions and working conditions, which are very, very poor in many cases, that is something that can be done. On Iran, I would support I'm not in favor of sanctions generally, but I am in favor of selective sanctions on individuals, on bank accounts, on education of children, and so on. The remark I made about Iran was, I think that the West has progressively, over 20 years, restricted the economic development of Iran to the detriment of its population. And every time this restriction has happened, the technocratic side of Iranian society has lost out, and the more religious and dogmatic side has blossomed. I don't think that I'm a strong believer in engagement watched by civil society, with openness to civil society, but I think the efforts on the whole by the West, in part led by the United States, but also by Europe, has had, in my opinion, extremely unfortunate consequences. And we just need to look at where it's worked and where it hasn't worked, it normally hasn't worked, and change it. Bloomberg News, bankers and whitewash. What's going on? I don't know. When I retired from Shell as an executive in 2001, I was involved in the UN in the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And after a while, I found that if you work for a corporation, they're fairly disciplined. Civil society, if you work in the voluntary sector, work expands enormously to fill every hour of the day. So I thought the only solution, partly because my civil society friends thought that the work I was doing was atoning for past sins, and my business friends thought it was okay for me because I'd retired, so I could go all soft and woolly, and I came to the conclusion that the only thing to do was actually to go back to work. So I went to work for a mining company, and if there's one thing worse than an oil company, it's a mining company. In order to demonstrate that, in my opinion, there was nothing to be ashamed of. We need energy and we need minerals, and they need to be extracted responsibly, and we need bankers.
Enough. Thank you for now.